Hey everyone, just give us a second. Just waiting for a few people to file in before we get started. Welcome to the Rewind. Today we're celebrating Dr. Julius Erving, Dr. J. Give us a second and we will be getting started as soon as some of the people I need to file into the room. Thanks. Hey Micah, I'm waiting for some of my Dr. J fans to join. One of them is in LA and he was co-hosting, so I'm waiting for him to kind of get into the room. I know he's up. It's because I was he was in the chat. So just give us a second and we will get started. Because if he can't get on, I'm probably going to move this room. Because I was trying to sneak it in before the NFL. But yeah, I should have just left it for Tuesday and called it a day. So I'm considering doing that. Hey Jay. Um, hey Micah.
Maliika. Yeah, I'm interested to talk about Dr. J, a big part of NBA history. So, ready for the discussion?
Especially Nets history. He's a big part of Nets history. I mean, like he got us our first championship, basically.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
in that
I'm
era,
really,
yeah,
and that I mean, it was with the ABA, but it is the team's history. I'm a person that, like, there are some who believe that, like decades ago, that's not the same team. It technically wasn't. Different owner, different league, even when Julius played for Dr. J, played for the Nets. But still, it is the team's history and how we came to be. So when like people say KD is the greatest net, he's the greatest modern net. That I can't forget. Dr. J was also a net. Um, so to me, those two are the best nets ever with Jason Kidd being the one that got us. He got us to the finals, but I can't dismiss Dr. J from our history. So today we're going to show Dr. J some love. If you want to come to the stage, please come to the stage. We have a few more people in here, so I'm going to get started. What I like to do is like to make sure there's certain people in the room before I get started because I don't like to sound like a monologue. So I'm going to get started. Micah, you're up here, so please chime in whenever you have a question or a point. But let me do a formal opening. Thank you for attending the Rewind. We are a show that talks about basketball history and basketball topics that you don't see every day in the news. Today, we are paying tribute to Dr. J, one of the greatest Nets, one of the greatest players to ever play the game, small forward from Long Island, New York. And we're going to show Dr. J the respect he deserves. I feel like when we talk about greatest players, top 10, top 15, Dr. J's name is not mentioned, but he laid the groundwork for what you see from some players today. And it's important that we recognize the seed that this stems from. You recognize the seed because Dr. J once said, like like the Michael Jordans, the LeBron James, and some of these players come from his tree, and he's right. These players do come from his tree. So, but we're going to take it back and start him from Long Island because at the time when Dr. J came up, there you go, Jason. Hey, Jason. I was waiting for you. I was trying to wait for you because I didn't want to sound like a monologue. So thank you for joining me, Jason, out there in California. It is 9:09 his time. So I thank him for being up here with me because I have all my notes sitting here, but I didn't want to, you know, do a monologue like I'm a professor. So I thank you for being here. You want to say hi to the people? Jason? He will chime in when he can. So let me just start. With Dr. J, he came from, like I said, Long Island. And when he was raised in the inner city, and when he started playing ball, he played ball. When he was coming up, ball was played differently, like in schools than in the playground. He would do all of his moves on the playground like street ball, but when he played organized ball, those are the type of things that weren't really done in schools and like in high schools and things of that nature. So, Jason, are you there?
I'm here. Yes.
Yes, I was starting
Yes.
from Long Island and how
Yeah.
back then, when he was in high school, especially because the dunk, of course, will come to be banned, because of Kareem. We're going
That's
to
right.
blame it all on Kareem.
Got to
Um,
blame everything on Kareem. Everybody always does. He's okay. He's got big shoulders. He can handle it.
so we starting off when he was in Long Island because he really wasn't recruited out of Long Island, when he was in high school.
No.
He didn't really get a lot of attention at that time. But a lot of his good work was done on the hardwood. It was done outside in street ball when he was playing then. When he was playing in high school, it was, like you want to talk a little bit about back then how there were really two types of brands of basketball being played.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's pretty simple. Organized basketball uh, was run by 98% white guys,
Mm-hmm.
and was very organized. It's the best way to put it. And the freelancing,
Yep.
was frowned upon. And you were
Yep.
often even taken out of the game if you did something funky or outside of what the coach had dictated, or what your position dictated. It was also very position focused. If you
Yep.
were a point guard, you did certain things. If you were the shooting guard, you stayed in certain areas and kind of did your thing there. And so, it was pretty strict as far as that goes. And I think even young, Julius was different, and he had a different body. He had those hands, and he had the desire to, be creative, and that was not really accepted uh, in organized ball all the way through rec league, junior high, high school, and then college. I mean,
Yeah, he went the same thing in college where
he
you
was
really didn't
incredibly
see him.
restricted. Yeah, he was incredibly restricted by the rules and by his coach. Even though, you know, my understanding is he put on some shows in practice and
Yep, practice.
before practice and
Mm-hmm.
after practice, and the guys on the team knew and the coach knew, but it was just a different time. And I think he was also not a guy who pushed the boundaries.
He
He
respected
was,
his coaches and order
he did,
and
he
all of
did.
that, which
He,
I respect. But it was like he needed to go to the Rucker, or he did the Rucker over the summer.
well,
Um,
I think that's if we could talk about that, it's one of my
yeah.
favorite things to talk about because it's just a timing thing with him. Um, you know, he did go on one of these tours. That was he was picked to go on one of these all-star tours, and that was one of the most interesting things I found out about him. Is it was on that tour that he felt like he realized he could be a pro. He was as good as these other guys who were considered, you know, more important than him. He was the last guy on the team. And in practice with those guys, he realized he was probably the best guy on the floor. And they were talking about the contracts they were going to get and the cars they were going to buy. And he was thinking to himself for the first time, you know, I've been kicking these guys' butt. And they're talking about they're going to get $70,000 and $50,000 and buy a Cadillac. And you know what? Wait a minute. That's potentially my future. And I think he played one more year at UMass, and then because of the
Yeah, his
ABA,
junior year. Mm-hmm.
there was an opportunity. And so when he signed, that was pretty surprising to everybody, including him. But the timing of it allowed him to go to the Rucker that summer. And I mean, I think that was just one of those. I think we should all be thrilled that it worked out that way because at that time the Rucker was it in New York.
Yes.
It was it. I mean, and they talk about
I wish I could have witnessed, you know what I mean? Like when I
yeah,
see the pictures of people on the branches, people sitting on top of the schools on different levels, like there were people everywhere just to see.
yeah. I mean, it was
Yeah, like I wish I could have been
well.
there
It
for
wasn't.
that.
It wasn't just to see him. That's the other thing. It had been going
Yeah.
on for a while, and it was
Mhm.
like that when the guy showed up, whoever the guy was,
Mhm. Mhm.
and that's where you went to test yourself. I mean, that was the thing. Is that that's where the young guys went to test themselves against pros and also the street legends. You know, you had to play against Earl Manigault. You had
Mhm.
to play against
Mhm.
Joe Hammond, and those guys would light you up, and they drop 50 on you and talk, you know, smack all day, and you know you could be embarrassed and humiliated, and you'd have to come back the next year if you wanted to. So it was really a serious test, and that's why everybody showed up to see, okay, who's got it and who doesn't. And the pros, a lot of pros didn't want to play there because
Mhm.
they could
Mhm.
get embarrassed, and maybe they didn't have that kind of a game, and so some guys
Or
avoided
you
it. A
can
lot,
go in there and wreck shop and walk out, you know, with a legendary kind of,
that's
you know,
right.
halo over you.
That's right, but there's a lot of pressure there, a weird kind of pressure, a fun kind of pressure. Anyway, he showed up, and you know I don't know if it was the first day. He doesn't, I don't think, get real specific about it, but within a few days, you know, he was encouraged there to do all the things he had been told he couldn't do.
Mhm.
And I think also, and he's talked about this a few times, when he did some of his, you know, one-handed swooping 2 feet over the rim, reverse dunks, you know, the place just went bananas, and the game basically stopped because people were going too crazy. Uh, and you know that got him. He was like, "Oh, okay, you know, I because I can do that a lot." And then he started doing it. And I think it was one of those momentum things for him where his confidence just took over day by day by day by day. And then more and more people started showing up. And then he became the show. And it didn't take long before the word was out that there was a young guy that was doing these things that nobody had ever seen. And I think you also have to remember, this is what always gets me. Nobody ever did this. Like even those guys, they were smaller. Earl Manigault was smaller. Joe Hammond was smaller. The bigger guys, they were more power guys. He
Yeah,
was,
he was 6'7" by this time.
yeah, he
So
was 6'7" with
with
those
long arms and those big
long
hands.
arms and those hands. So he was the
Mm-hmm.
combination of the young guys with all that creativity and bounce. And then he was a big guy, and he was doing stuff that just, maybe you saw once or twice, and he was doing it every 6 minutes because it was a free flowing game. It wasn't a ton of defense being played. And you could imagine him in that kind of environment. It's ridiculous. It's just turn him loose. And so him being able to be there and have that happen and play against pros, that was the other thing. He was doing it on pros. He was doing it on guys in the NBA. And he was doing it with Charlie Scott, who had played a year in the ABA, who was a legend in New York. And he played on the team with Charlie Scott. It was supposed to be Charlie Scott's team, but
Yeah, when he went to the Virginia Squires.
yeah.
Yeah, it was Charlie Scott's team technically.
Well, and the Rucker
But
team was supposed to be Charlie's team too. but but Doc was there, and things happen. So I just think that having that experience that summer was exactly what he needed, and then going into the ABA instead of the NBA, because the NBA was very tight and boring at that time, and they did
yeah,
not.
they really didn't allow for the NBA. Really didn't allow for the flashiness that the ABA. They were seen as the fun
No.
league. They had the 3-point shot. They had the dunk, and they were dunking there where you weren't really doing that at the time in the NBA. So they were seen as the ABA was a quote unquote the fun league, but the fun league didn't have a national TV deal. And that helped, that really strapped the owners. Let's get a question. Micah, do you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Um, more of a comment is during that time era, it it was widely considered that vast majority of the talent resided in the ABA. So I think that goes understated is that Dr. J was dominating a league that had the vast majority of the talent at that time period.
Well, yeah, he was. But yeah, JB, I see you. I'm gonna let Jason continue with his point, and then we'll bring you. Then I will bring you in.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with that. I don't think they had the vast majority of the talent in 71, 72. Maybe a couple years later. Not at that time. They had a lot of top end talent. The NBA was deeper and much bigger. But that was also beneficial for Doc because there were not all the big men that he would have to deal with in the NBA, in the ABA. So there were a lot of, 6'10 skinny centers, a lot of forwards. So he was free to go to the basket. And in the NBA, it would have been a little bit different for him. He still would have been him, but it would have been different. So I just think, again, it was really fortuitous. It was really worked out really, really well. And the other thing, that first year that I think is so good for him is that it wasn't his team. He had that Rucker experience, but he was still unknown outside New York.
He
And
had that time to grow
exactly,
in Virginia, and then he played with George Gervin too, a very young George Gervin,
yeah,
but
very
he got
young.
that time with him as well.
But I mean, I think that rookie year, it was Charlie Scott's team. He was one of the 3 or 5 best players in the ABA. He had been rookie of the year. He was the leading scorer that year. He took the most shots of anybody in the league, even though Doc was on the team. So he was the second guy, and they didn't run out of plays for him. And he was able to just grow without the pressure of being the guy. And then the wild thing is, Charlie Scott left the team with 12
Yeah,
games
that
to
was
go.
going to ask about that with Charlie Scott leaving the team. Like, did they? Because would Dr. J try to lead the team and jump to the ABA with the Hawks? Like a few years later,
It was
like
it was
it,
after that year. He tried
it
to
was
do
a
the same thing.
it was a battle. Like they fought, and he eventually had to go back. He was able to keep his signing bonus, and he was able to keep his money, but he had to go back to the Squires, and it was like a big thing.
It was
Like
a
like
huge thing.
Milwaukee got paid, and like it was a big thing. I was wanted to ask when Charlie Scott jumped to the Suns, because it was the Suns he jumped to, right? The Phoenix.
Oops.
Was there any compensation that had to be given up for Charlie Scott with that?
No,
Because Dr. J mentions it in the book, but he doesn't mention that anything
I don't.
happened. He went to the Suns,
I
and
don't believe so. I don't think they received anything. But I mean, I think the cool thing for Doc was that at that point he was ready. You know, he'd played 70 games.
Yeah, he was ready to lead at that
Yeah, and
time.
then
Yeah.
sometimes, you know, you're thrust into a situation and either you can handle it or you can't. And every time in his career something like that happened, you know, he not only handled it, he just dominated. And this was the first time. And his playoff run as a rookie, he came within one game of going to the finals. And I mean,
Yep.
his first playoff series against Miami, he averaged like 44 and
Yeah.
20 some rebounds a game. He just went nuts because he was finally the guy. And they ran everything.
He was finally the guy, and the chains were off. Like he was
Exactly.
able to play his style of the game. JP, you want to get in a comment or question here before we continue?
I have questions. I'm not going to have enormous opinions. Do you want me to ask a question, or do you want me to?
You can ask your question as long as it's in the period we're discussing. Like
it is.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm not. This isn't HoopSpaces. I don't make jokes and things about the past.
No, I know you understand. Yep. Go ahead.
So, I mean, I guess it's sort of a sliding doors question that I have for Jason and for you too, Maliika. But really for the historian here.
Yep.
I've reviewed Dr. J's history a little bit, and this idea that the Knicks could have had Dr. J, that they could have, that all of this could have been different.
They could have though, but that was later. They could have.
I know, but still, it feels like it feels like they just missed the wild opportunity at the time. And like, does Dr. J ever reflect on that? Like, I know Knicks fans do, but like, does Dr. J ever think to himself, like, this whole thing could have been different? I mean, he's playing literally right down the street. I mean, weren't the New York Nets like even in New York at that time, or am I way off on this?
No, we're not there yet, but that was in.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get.
Yeah, he didn't get to the Nets until '73, but he could. The Knicks could have had him. And correct me if I'm wrong here. Before he went to the Philly, like 70.
Well, yeah,
I think 77.
Yeah, it was
around that.
It was. I mean, he was the reason for the merger.
Yep.
And the Knicks screwed up. There's varying reports about why and who made the decision, or if it was actually a decision, or they just kind of didn't do it.
In the book, they wanted the money, and with the way that Dr. J said, he said they wanted the $4.8 million.
Yeah.
And they didn't want. They had what did they have? Walt Frazier. They had somebody at the time, and they didn't want they for some reason, whoever the GM was, didn't want them playing together. And I was like, what? Like, that's what he was told, I guess. Well, like, that's why the Knicks didn't get him.
That's what he was told. I don't know. I do know that, and I think it's pretty true of the doc too. These guys, they don't look back like that very much. They don't play the what if game, because as an athlete, you got to play the cards that are in front of you. And his experience in Philly was pretty awesome. And he's an icon there, and I think it's important to him. So I don't think he does that. I know he was very friendly with Clyde. Clyde got him his agent. Clyde got him the clothes. That's the thing a lot of people don't know, and that happened early. So they were buddies.
Yeah, they were friendly. He talks about how they had a really good relationship, and they wanted to play together.
Yeah, Clyde.
It just didn't happen.
Yeah, it just didn't happen. And those things are out of the players, especially in that era. They had no say in any of it. So he went where he was told to go, and that ended up being Philly. But as a Knicks fan, I mean that basically ruined the franchise. For 15 years until Bernard King. I mean that
imagine what they could have had if they got if they at that time. How many more championships the Knicks could have won had they had Dr. J in that lineup.
Yeah,
like
NBA would have been very different.
They would have been unbeatable, quite frankly. But the Knicks wanted the 4.8 at the time. They wanted the money, and they had a different idea of how they wanted to carve out their team. JB, let me get a little further because we didn't even get to the Nets yet.
Yeah.
So let us.
It's not here yet.
I wasn't trying to dominate this because I didn't realize that.
No, 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 no. You're not dominating, but I am trying to move us. Let's get to the Nets, and then we're going to get to the Sixers soon. But we need to get to his Nets time, and we're just about there. He played 1 year with Gervin, a very young Gervin. He took him under his wing. He talked about the times they would bring women home to his house and all kinds of stuff. But like he played with him on the floor. He saw what kind of player Gervin was and who he was going to be. But George Gervin was only 19 the year that they played together. Um, Anything you want to say about that time and his final year with the Squires?
Yeah, I think that was a weird year. He had tried to leave, then was told he had to go back, came back to the team late. They had lost some guys, and they kind of didn't have the mojo that they had the previous year. He had an unbelievable year because he was unbelievable. And I mean, his numbers were off the charts and he was awesome. But I think it was kind of an in-between year for him. And then they had money troubles there. They always did. And they eventually, got him to the Nets. So I think for him, that was kind of not a lost year, but it was a weird year. It was his first year just being the guy. So that was cool. And he averaged a ton of points and a ton of rebounds and did his thing, but they weren't as good. And they got knocked out of the playoffs. And then he went to the Nets. The one thing I want to say, I got to jump off and I can jump back on in a little while. But the thing I did not know that I learned that I thought was so cool was that when he got to the Nets, their first or second exhibition game, so his first or second game as a Net was against the Knicks in the Garden in fall of '73. So the Knicks were the defending champions, and they had the whole team back. And here was Dr. J and an unbelievably young Nets team, average age like 24. And they went into the Garden. The Garden was sold out because people in New York knew about Julius. So it was a big deal. And he struggled in the first quarter and then just dominated the game. He had 4 or 5 huge dunks over Clyde and Bradley and Phil Jackson. And I just felt like that was, again, him announcing himself under pressure and just rising to the occasion and just saying, you know what, I'm here and I'm the real deal. These are the Knicks. They're the best team in the world. And I'm just going to dunk all over them and beat them. And he did. And, that team ultimately, the Nets went on to win the title. And I just feel like every time he was put in those positions, he rose to the occasion and showed, what a special, unique player he was and did things that people hadn't seen. They all went to see that. And every time people went to see him, he showed them. He did it. And I mean, to me, that's the mark of all-time greatness. And he was that guy. So, when he got to the Nets, it was game on because he was back home and they had a good young team and watch out.
Can I ask Jason a question before he hops off really quickly?
Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Hey, I'm sorry. I don't want him to leave before I ask this question.
Ask.
If everybody had seen this in the ABA, as it seems like, I mean, hell, the history says it. I mean, you can do a Google search and see that everything you're saying is true, right? Where like he would dominate, he would get massive amounts of scoring, he would get mass amounts of rebounding. At some point, like, doesn't your own like self, like, it's like being hit in the head with like a frying pan. Right? I mean, I get it that like you may have some doubts, like can he rise to the level of competition? Are things going to be different? But like at some point, how do these executives like rationalize it all these years later that like what was going on right in front of your eyes wouldn't translate? Am I way off on this?
When you say
he was a rock star.
When you say wouldn't translate, what are you saying?
Well, what I mean by that is like, I mean, I gave you the Knicks interpretation, but like all of the executives in the NBA, everybody who would be a general manager had to see this and be like, am I way off base? You can tell me.
You're right. The answer is kind of ridiculous, which is they were insanely arrogant. I mean, that's the answer, is that the NBA was unbelievably arrogant and did not believe that what guys did in the ABA would translate, and they even poo-pooed the exhibition games. like, oh, our guys weren't trying. It's an exhibition game. It didn't mean anything. If we really played hard, we would hold him down. That kind of stuff isn't winning basketball. I mean, there was that attitude. That was the prevalent attitude at that time. It was wrong.
Yeah, the NBA had no respect
No
for
respect.
really the ABA.
There were a few guys. There's always a few that had the vision, but the majority were incredibly arrogant. They also did not scout that much. It was still a weird time. Most teams were very, very small. Front offices were very small. One or two guys did most of the work, and they were just arrogant. They were just wrong. I'll give you one more example. Moses Malone, okay, played 2 years in the ABA as a teenager, right? Came right out of high school. He had some unbelievable games in the ABA. He held his own in the playoffs as rookie with Artis Gilmore. I think everybody had an idea how good Artis Gilmore was. And Malone, at 19 years old, had a couple monster games against him. But when the dispersal draft came and the merger, he was on 3 teams, got bounced around, and nobody wanted him. He was traded twice in a week because they just didn't believe that,
It's insane.
they thought he's 20.
It really is insane.
It was because of their arrogance. They just hadn't seen him. They didn't really look at the box scores. They didn't think about it much. They heard he was skinny. He was 20 years old. He had a big contract. Screw it. We don't need him. And he's Moses Malone. He'd played 2 years. This was not a mystery, but it was to them. That's how they viewed it. And that's the answer. It's a weird answer, but it is. I mean, it's just how it was. And some guys paid for it. They lost their jobs, but it was just a very, very different time, and they were just wrong. You're right to think that they should have seen it, but they didn't. They just didn't believe it. They believed it when he got in. I'll tell you that.
That's just nuts to me, Jason.
Nuts.
The idea that, okay, so my game is the ball goes through the hoop and I score points, right? That's how I get points. The team that scores the most points by the ball going through the hoop a whole bunch of times is the winner. I see a person doing that, and even if I'm skeptical that he'll be able to do it against my competition, I can't ignore the fact that the ball continues to go through the hoop over and over and over again. The picture that you're painting to me is that these people are so prideful. They're so believing that their talent level is so much farther superior that they're ignoring the guy who is dominating the level of competition that he's playing, that is literally playing the same game.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's the
bonkers.
That's
Go
the
ahead.
answer.
I'm sorry. I'll stop.
That's the answer. You're right to be that incredulous. That's the answer. And it proved out. There were still guys that were stunned when he did it in the NBA. Stunned. And George McGinnis had done it the year before. I mean, it made no sense, but it's just how it was. All right, I got to jump. I'll be back in like 20 minutes, something like that. So if you guys are still doing it, happy to be back.
I will still be here. Jump back in 20 minutes.
I will.
And yeah.
Appreciate the time. This was fun. I'll be back.
Thank you. Thank
right.
you. We'll
keep it rolling.
Okay.
All right.
Alrighty. Brad, you wanted a question? You had a question before we continue?
Yeah, I had a comment related to what you were just speaking about. I don't think it's just arrogance. I think the way Dr. J scored, the flamboyant way that he put the ball in the hoop, as the other gentleman was talking about, and as you led with this particular space talking about the NBA and the ABA and the contrast between the two, I believe the executives of the NBA just didn't view that way of scoring as being entertaining. They were running a more boring type of way of playing basketball.
Yeah, they had a different viewpoint. Yeah.
Yeah, straight organized way of playing the game. Very stiff way, professional, if you want to say. So when they see Dr. J do all of those things, they didn't perceive it as something that is entertaining while still playing the game of basketball, which is a very important aspect of even today. When we watch it today, we marvel at some of the highlights. So this is what I think. I think those people were they had tunnel vision. They just couldn't see the expanded nature that Dr. J brought to the game. And to this day, that's why we revel at him. He was a great basketball player, but he also did it with a unique flair that nobody else had done. And I think that point should be pushed a little bit more than what it has.
Well, yeah, Dr. J was the pinnacle at the time. Like he basically played a brand of ball that with the ABA had he was the number one player in the ABA, even though they had other really good players in that league. They were flashy, they played street ball. The NBA didn't play that style. So yeah, there was a stark contrast to how both leagues approached the game. Um, and I will say the Nets, we're going to get to the Nets in a minute, but when you look at ABA, there were a lot of teams that were having money problems. They weren't able to keep their teams together or even stay in business. Like the ABA, when you look at the New York Nets, they were able to sell tickets and pack their arena in Long Island because of Dr. J. They were one of the few teams they were able to consistently have an audience because they were the New York market and they had Dr. J. So they were like, he was like he sold the league and New York was basically lucky to have him. I thought JP tried to come up, but he left. So we're going to now continue and talk about when he joined the Nets in 1973. They also got a coach that at first Dr. J didn't know how he felt about him, Kevin Lowry. He didn't know how he felt about Kevin Lowry because he didn't have like the greatest background at the time, and he just didn't know how to, he didn't know how to make him out. David Pusher was one of the executives there, and they felt he was a good pairing for that team. And it turns out Dr. J was like, he was right. Um, Kevin was a tough coach. He didn't, give anyone favoritism, but he got Dr. J to buy him pretty early. And with Dr. J being the number one guy on the team, that got everyone else to buy in. They saw it pretty early in the season. They didn't have that kind of bruiser, that type of player you need in a forward position that, like will be on the floor, take some of that punishment, dish it out, also still be an offensive presence on the floor. They didn't have that player, and they, quite frankly, there was one player giving Dr. J problems. It was Wendell Latner was basically that player that the Nets felt they had to sign, or he could have injured Dr. J. Like that's just the way he played. Like he was a bruiser. He was one of those players that would go after lead. That was Dr. J. That guy. So once Wendell Latner, he was a missing piece for that Nets team. Once he got Wendell Latner, they were off to the races, and that was the year the Nets actually won their first championship. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, hey, what's going on? Great space. Loving the conversation. Just wanted to real quick. I think one piece that we missed in regards to Dr. J and just the idea that the NBA didn't value him as much as they probably should have. I agree with that, but also that there was a war for Dr. J. The Milwaukee Bucks and Atlanta Hawks.
Yeah.
They exchanged much money and much debate to try to get Dr. J. So there was a little bit of a fight. I do think that the NBA, at least from people that I've talked to that were around those circles, they definitely thought that Dr. J was going to be good. They just didn't know to what level, just because of the simple fact,
Mm-hmm.
much of the points here, playing style and everything else. But no, he definitely was wanted. I just think so many people at that time in the NBA, you're talking about Red Auerbach and some of the other guys, they just had a view about professional basketball that was such alien from what the ABA was. Um, so I didn't want that part to get lost in the beautiful discussion we're having about Dr. J.
Jason, you're back quicker than I. You're
I
back.
thought I'm going to be in and out.
Okay.
Where
I
are
was
we?
just talking about Kevin Lowry. At first, Dr. J was talking about he didn't know what to make of Kevin Lowry, when he was hired as the head coach, and but he got to see that he was the coach that they needed. He was tough on everyone, and Kevin
Well,
Lowry told him
I have a
because
funny.
go ahead.
I have a funny story about that. So, I've gotten to know Brian Taylor pretty well, who was the point guard on those teams. And we've talked a lot about that year, that team. And so I mentioned to him once that I had read something that, Dr. J said, one of the reasons he respected Kevin was because Kevin was tough on everyone. And Kevin yelled at him just as much as he yelled at everybody. And Kevin was a yeller. He was a screamer. And he thought that was very important because, the other players needed to see that he was going to be as tough on Doc as he was on everybody else. And that all makes sense. So when I said it to Brian, I said it like it was, no big deal and the obvious truth. And he started laughing like I told the greatest joke of all time. And I had to wait for him to stop laughing. And I said, "What's so funny?" He goes, "Well, he could say that." He said, "I'm racking my brain and I'm trying to think of one time that Kevin really screamed at the Doc. Can't come up with it." So, everybody has different memories. He was not joking, but he said, "Well, maybe I'm forgetting a few times, but." He said, Kevin was smart. He knew, I don't have to scream at him. He does all the right things. He said, but I don't really remember that. There were a couple guys Kevin really liked to scream at. One was Super John Williamson. And he goes, I guess maybe he did, but I think Doc is stretching it a little bit there. And I just thought that was really, really funny because nobody respects Doc more than Brian. And they're very close. And he just thought that was hilarious. So I thought that was really, really funny. Just different memories, I guess, different interpretations. But Brian,
that is hilarious
absolutely.
Because in the book he was very clear on multiple occasions that he felt that Kevin Lowry used him to kind of get through to the team, that if they saw him yelling at him and being tough on him,
that's right,
that the rest of the team will take heed. And because he
Yep.
felt Kevin knew, the rank and order of, like he was the top player, and if the top player is taking it, then they would have no choice but to take it. So that's
exactly.
why he was like on board. And I was like, okay. Like, what do you think of?
Yeah.
Jay is also very clear that a key piece that they eventually got that was a bruiser, he was a brutal to play, was Wendell Ladner. And when they did trade for him, that was a key addition to help them win the championship. What do you think about Wendell Ladner and his fit with the team and winning the championship that year?
Yeah, I mean, I get a lot of that from Brian and a couple other guys I talked to, and I mean that was the piece they needed. Brian said we really needed toughness, and we needed somebody to protect Doc, and Wendell was that guy. And he had the funny thing is that he had beat up on Doc for 2 years straight, probably more than anybody in the league. He was a physical.
He said that. He said he was brutal to play, so he was happy he
Well, and
was on his team.
Yeah, he guarded, guys like that. He was a small forward, 6'6", strong guy. So he guarded all the scorers like Doc and Rick Barry and Roger Brown and whoever. And he was just insanely physical player and kind of crazy. And, he would do anything at any time. So they were ecstatic to get him, A, to get him off Doc, and B, to have him have Doc's back and to have him in the lineup because they needed some toughness and rebounding. And he gave them both. And I think sometimes those kind of trades can just put everybody in their proper role. And that seems to be how it worked out there, is that kind of put the minutes where they needed to be. And everybody got, at that point, they knew everybody's game. And then Lockery was able to put guys in the right role at the right time, play in the right minutes. It really helped Larry Keenan, who was not a physical player, but was an unbelievable, fast break forward and had great moves around the basket, unstoppable offensive player, but did not play a lot of D and wasn't that tough. And so it just was the right guy at the right time. Plus he was fun. And I think the players just thought he was absolutely crazy off the court, hilarious. They loved going out with him. He was funny. He was Southern. He was
Dr. J
different.
was very clear about that. Like, he was hilarious, like just hilarious. So yeah, he
That
really,
helps too.
really liked him. He really respected him as a teammate and liked him off the court. They lived close together out there in Long Island, and they would sometimes come in together. So when after they won the championship, which was amazing for the Nets and for Dr. J, he also won the MVP that season, I believe, and he was on top of the world. So in 1975, when Wendell Ladner dies in a plane, he was dead when he died in that plane crash. And that changed the net. Like the Nets weren't really. They had to make a few trades that season before the '76 championship, which the league was diving at that point. It was going down. That even the Nets were feeling some type of pressure with the merger that was about to take place. They eventually
Yep.
did win the championship in '76. They did win a championship, but it was less teams. He made a note that it was less teams. Before, I didn't want to glance over the '76 championship before talking about the All-Star game in '76, because even though there were less teams, there were only 7 teams in the league at the time that Dr. J notes.
Yep.
He
Yep.
said that the '76 slam dunk, the '76 All-Star game, when they had the slam dunk contest, and I believe this was the first one, '76, with David Thompson, George Gervin, and a few others. That the funny thing is, he felt like David Thompson had the better dunks. he admitted it,
Well,
like in the book, that he thought the better dunks, the best dunk he saw was David Thompson's dunk. But
yeah. Well,
yeah.
that was, that was really, first of all, the All-Star game was the Denver team against the rest of the league. So that
Mm-hmm.
tells you something
Mm-hmm.
about where the league was at. And the dunk contest was really, David against Doctor. I mean, that they were the two guys. David Thompson was an insanely popular player because of what he had done in college, and he did it on television, on national TV. He beat UCLA and did things that people
He
just
was
hadn't
really
seen if they hadn't
good.
seen Dr. J.
I
He
will
was
say this
insanely
was,
good.
it's amazing what he could have. Just think about what he could have been had he not got started with the drugs. He could have been out of this world. The
Mm-hmm.
talent was there. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, he was the hometown guy, and he was the Skywalker. He was David Thompson. So it was really he against Dr. J, and then they added in, they had 3 or 4 other amazing dunkers, but it was those two, and they did their thing. As Doc says in the book, David Thompson was unbelievable. He rose to the occasion. He was ready for this, and he practiced. He's talked
Mm-hmm.
about that. He
Mm-hmm.
practiced. He was ready because he knew Doc was coming, and he wanted to beat him. And he threw down a 360. Nobody had ever seen that before, other I think than the Nuggets in practice. They knew he was going to
Mm-hmm.
do it, but then Doc went from the free throw line, and that was that. So again, that's him rising to the occasion, right? He got put on, the pressure was on him, and he went, okay, I got to do something, and he did, which he always did.
But Doc
The one
also
thing
admitted he didn't take, he was over the line. He admitted he was over the line for the free throw line in the book.
he was,
He said, I was over the line. I'm gonna become clean. I was over the line when I took off from, that point. But I just thought that was funny that he's admitting it in the book now. Like, but yeah.
well,
But
people still talk about it, and they still, and so he, I guess he wanted to say it. But I think one thing that needs to be noted about that last Nets team, and Brian talks to me about this all the time, was they had some toughness again, and they needed that. They had Rich Jones, House Jones, one of the toughest guys in the ABA, the whole length of the ABA, and Tim Bassett was also extremely physical, tough player. And Brian said he thought those guys were the key to the team because they did all the dirty work. They set all the screens. They got all the rebounds. They protected you in all the fights. They started some of the fights. And that team needed that. And it's very similar to what Ladner did. When you have some finesse players, you need some power players. You need some super tough guys, especially in that era. And they had them. And those guys never get any credit. But their teammates definitely gave them a lot of credit and still talk about them. So I think those guys were very important to that title. And it
I
was,
think
it
that's
wasn't easy.
funny.
They had to be.
I think that's funny that you say that, because I feel like we can use a bruiser, some guy that can come in there and take some punishment from our finesse guys right now. But yeah, the makeup of that team, even Dr. J says, was perfect for what was needed to win the chip. But he was he knew the league was going down, and he began to get worried about his contract being paid out. And for the first time, because one of the things he noted when he joined the Nets was he was happy about being with the Nets because that was the one team that was one of the teams he didn't have to worry. They could keep the team together. They can afford to keep the team together. Like it was a pretty stable franchise compared to the other
Yep.
franchises in the ABA. Like they would go on the road and like those torturous road trips in the ABA, and they would go in these empty arenas, but their home arena was never their home games were just ridiculous compared to the rest of the ABA. And he felt secure, but now he was hearing rumblings about the Knicks
Mm-hmm.
wanting close to 5 million to join the New York metro area. And like there were rumblings that he would, with all this money that needed to be paid out to enter the NBA for the Nets, they couldn't afford his contract. And he was told that by the owner at the time, and he was strapped. So he basically sat out the 76 to 77 season. Anything you want to say on that before he goes to Philly eventually?
Well, yeah, he was. He got caught in the crossfire. He was the guy, and so how they were going to deal with him was really the biggest question of the whole merger. So I think again he was stuck not having the power. Really, he and his agent, pushed as hard as they could. He had a very tough agent, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, uh, eventually he ends up in Philly, and he shows up, and they had a funky, weird team, not the right team around him. But
Yeah, they didn't seem in the book, like it didn't seem he had a really good relationship with Daryl Dawkins. Um, and
well,
there was George McGinnis's team. Um,
mm-hmm.
and he was just trying to find his place where he fit in, on that team the first year. And he really didn't get to show out until they got to the finals, and he showed who he was. But go
Yep.
ahead, Jay.
Yeah, it's exactly right. I just think it was a shame because he was at his peak at that point, and it was just too funky a team. There's too many guys that wanted the ball, too many guys that were just scorers, that didn't pass the ball, didn't want to. It was a team full of scorers, and here you had the best scorer in the world, and he's basically just another guy getting 15 shots and passing the ball and trying to fit in. He should never try to fit in. You got to put the pieces around an all-time great like that, and they didn't. And it was just an odd situation, but he was so good uh, that they got to the finals and won the first two games. And if it wasn't for the fight, they might have won the series. And he's,
Yeah,
again, he also knew that the finals would be the first time a lot of people were seeing him.
yeah,
And I think
yeah,
that was part of his drive to, show again. And this is, I guess, my theme. But again, the pressure was on and the lights were the brightest. And I mean, I know for me, that was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. I was 15 and I was so excited to see those finals and see him. And he put on a show like you just cannot imagine. I mean, he threw down 3 or 4 dunks in the first couple games that were all time and are still all time great dunks 40 years later in the finals on Bill Walton, who was the best player in the league. And he
on
just dunked
national and
all
on
over.
national TV, because we were on national. The NBA was still what was. It was a weird, but they were on national TV at the time.
Yes. Yes. And
They weren't on tape delay.
everybody was looking forward to that series. Everybody. I mean, that series was prime time sports viewing for everybody who was interested in sports because it was finally we're going to get to see Dr. J, against the best team in the league
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
get to see him for a few games, in important games. And there was still some mystery around him. It was awesome. So, I mean, to me, that was all time.
And for many people, that was his debut. Like that
Exactly.
was because the ABA, remember, was not, nationally televised. So for many people, this was their first time seeing Dr. J, like ever.
Exactly.
And he put on a
Exactly.
show. He was able to finally show the nation like who he was, right, and what his brand of basketball was. Philly finally got to see the real Dr. J, because remember, he was not playing as the leader on the 76ers that year. George McGinnis was the leader. So when it got to the finals, he was finally able to show who he was. And I feel like
He
from
did.
that point on, that was, the Sixers became pretty much, his team, and they began to build a better team around him as a result.
Exactly. All right, I got to jump again. I'll be back.
Okay. Okay. Now we're on the Sixers. His Sixers time. That first year they did get to the finals, but Portland won that series, but it also changed the trajectory of the 76ers. The 76ers started to build around Dr. J, and unfortunately for Dr. J, people, like, they would do well in the season, get to the playoffs, and then nothing will happen. They wouldn't get to the big dance. We know that Dr. J won the championship in 70 and 83, but it took him 6 to 7 seasons to get there. Him getting to the finals, playing the Celtics and having to get through the Celtics to get to the finals, and then he would get to the finals and have to deal with the Lakers. So, it took him. It was, at that time, the NBA, like, it was really competitive at that time. Like, so it was hard in the East to get to the finals, because you had to go through the Celtics to get there, or them. And then so it was a battle. So by the time you got to the finals, like, it was like you went through you went through, like, one of the hardest triathlons of all time. By the time you got there, you had to battle, but you already went through a lot of battles. So I felt like by the time they got to the finals, it was, for a few of those seasons, it was it was pretty much harder. It was hard for them. Like 79, remember, like in 80 when they played the Lakers, it got to a game where Kareem was out. He had to leave because he injured his knee, his foot. And that was the game that Magic in every position in game 6, and they ended up winning the championship. Like, this rookie came out of nowhere, and that was supposed to be Dr. J's ring. But also, what was happening off the court is important to remember that off the court, Dr. J set the standard and the trend for players to follow in terms of endorsements. He was getting endorsements deals out the wazoo from a lot of companies, including Pepsi and others. And he was basically setting the standard. And that's when people were watching him off the court and the type of deals he was making. He was also negotiating to get stock options um, in these deals. That's where a lot of these, like Jordan and others, learned how to do that from, because Dr. J would share with them, like, how off the court he handled his business. He was amazing. He had really good partners, and they, in terms of managing his image and managing him off the court and on the court, he pretty much set the standard. He just needed and wanted that chip. He felt like it was eluding him. He had a lot of things happen in his personal life too, with his family. Um, and but at the time, getting that championship, some of those years he was dealing with his sister, was battling cancer, and he was dealing with that, as well as, watching his sister with terminal cancer, and then looking at and then with the Sixers, it was like his priorities, he admitted, was to his sister. And it was heartbreaking. But eventually, like, Brad, you're up here. Anything you wanted to say? Because you came up here for a reason. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think this topic that you brought up, Malika, is the one. I
Yeah.
think uh, I think Dr. J's number one, the legacy of Dr. J. I just tweeted it to you. The legacy of Dr. J is that he is the one individual basketball player that sells the brand of NBA basketball. As a kid, 10 years old, watching him, he's the first. He's my idol, I guess you would say. And I don't have many. It's just him and Muhammad Ali. But what I saw him do, I never saw any other player do it. I just remember just being amazed by the way that he can bring the house down. That term, bringing the house down, he's the one that started all that. A dunk, and people are just cheering play after play after the dunk. And he became the ambassador of the NBA. And I think a lot of people watching basketball today don't realize that Dr. J is the reason for NBA growing because he scored with flash. He was very flamboyant on the court, but he was classy off the court. So
Yeah,
you really
people.
kind of had. Go ahead.
Yeah, people credit, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson for, like saving the league. I think it's important to note that before they entered the league, though, the league was on a downturn at the time, and Dr. J entered the league in '77. And he was, even though you had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar still in the league, of course, at the time, it was Dr. J marketability off the court and his flash of the game on the court that helped the league continue for those years. Like they were holding on to Dr. J for dear life because with the drug use, and you had a lot of people through the league, and then you had fans not really coming to games like they were previous. They just weren't coming to games. Attendance was at a low. But when Dr. J was, would enter arenas, those arenas will sell out. Those arenas would be full. Like he basically kept the league going. It was that presence, and then when you got Bird and Magic, that only added to what Dr. J was doing. It just added, like to the league. It wasn't just Dr. J. Then it was you had Bird and Magic and that whole thing. But I think it's important to state just how vital he was to the league in those years. They have him to thank because he basically had the league on his back for those years. It was bad at that time in the league.
Yeah, very, very well stated. And I think for the league to grow, you needed those other elements, Magic and Bird, to complement the Julius Erving game. And in speaking with him when he was with the 76ers, and I was a huge 76er fan, obviously, and I hated the Celtics, but I could be objective watching Julius Erving play for the 76ers. And I knew that for the team to beat the elite teams of the league, which the 76ers were one of those teams, they needed someone who could score more than Julius Erving. Because even though I idolized him as a player, I knew he wasn't a great outside shooter. And I knew he was easier to defend when he was the main guy. And they didn't have, the other scorers who were able to kind of take over the game. So when they got Moses, I was very excited because I felt like now here we go. Because Doc is more like the second guy or 1A, 1B, whatever way you want to call it. And sure enough, they just dominated the league once they got Moses Malone. So that 76er team is extremely underrated in terms of the rankings of the best teams all time. I guess maybe I'm a little biased, but I just want to say that, because they dominated the league once they got Moses.
Yeah, that's another great thing that Dr. J talks about in the book is Moses was the piece they needed. In '83, they were the best team in the league that year. They won the most games. When they got Moses Malone, that it was pretty much that was it for the Sixers that year. Trading Darryl Dawkins and getting the piece, that important piece. It was that was the year that they beat the Lakers in the finals, and he got his championship. And the book, he was like, this is what winning a championship feels like. Okay, like he got that final piece. He was like, I have the MVPs, I have the endorsements off the court. You know what I mean? He was setting himself up for retirement pretty good. He was like, this is the last thing that I want. I wanted this. This is the last thing I wanted, and I finally got it. Like I have championships in the ABA, but the way they would remember, they didn't really respect the ABA then. They were, the way they talked about his ABA championships, that was in the minor leagues. They didn't matter. That was in the amateur league. So it was this championship, even though he of course he disagreed with that, like he loved the ABA and the players that came from there, but it put the crystal ball and it was the final piece on what he wanted as a player in this league. And he finally, like after that, he played a few more seasons in Philly. But I just one of the things I have to mention before we work our way towards the closeout is Dr. J notes that he was offended by Larry Bird when he said that Michael Jordan was the best player that he faced, in the playoffs. And he had a problem with that because he was like, I think he was playing mental games because our matchups that we had with the Celtics, they were real battles. And he thinks Larry Bird was playing mind games. Because he believes he was, like him or Magic. His battles with Magic were the toughest matchups that he had. And I think that when Larry Bird said that, and as an individual player, but it was like when players talk about players today, when you look at how fans look at players today, when you look at Jordan at the time, he was basically Dr. J, but he had his own like little spin on what Dr. J had and David Thompson. He was that next level of player at the time. So he had their pieces and he put his finesse on it. He was looking at him, I guess, as an individualized talent. But I just wanted to ask: does anyone believe there's something to Dr. J thinking that Larry Bird just didn't want to give Dr. J and the Sixers credit for being the toughest matchup? Like, do you think there's something there, Brad?
Yeah. This is how I see that point. Okay. First of all, Michael Jordan is Dr. J multiplied in the sense that
Yes.
Jordan had the ability of fadeaway jumper. He could beat you shooting the ball from the outside. I stated earlier, Julius Erving, while he shot the ball pretty good, he wasn't really great at it. He wasn't someone that would kill you at it. Jordan could kill you with it, fadeaway jumper. So when Larry says that, from Dr. J's perspective, they went at it. I remember those series. That was the best basketball I've ever seen in my life.
They were
They went at
brutal.
it.
Like, they went
It
at
was
it.
amazing, Maliika. It was I'm telling you right now, it was hatred. It was everything you want, and two teams going at it, and players not liking each other. Just everything. You had all of it. So I could see Dr. J. Julius Erving having a problem with Larry Bird saying that because he remembers the intensity of the battles between the two end teams. But what Larry was saying, and this goes to what you were saying, Larry is giving credit to the individual. And this is what a lot of people struggle with, the comparisons of individual players and not using the team aspect in that comparison. Larry Bird is telling you Michael Jordan is the best, and he is right about that. He is definitely right. But I could see Dr. J, his competitiveness, he's remembering the history between the two. And so his argument is a different argument than what Larry Bird was stating.
Thank you, Brad. Micah, go ahead, and then Matt.
Yeah, Brad pretty much said everything I was going to say. It's like when you look at the Chicago team with MJ, he was from the gate just incredible as an individual. But that Chicago's team, woof, they were bad. They were so bad. I think his first year in the league, they made the playoffs his first year, but that's just because the East
They
was
only
a little
won
bit
like
more
30
hot.
games, too. They had a very low
Yeah,
win total that year. They barely
right.
got in. I think it was 85.
Yeah,
Yeah, they barely got in.
yeah. They were, I believe, they were 30-52 and still made the postseason. And like until they found some form of building, they were pretty much like that. They were squeaking in because like all the top teams were beating down on a lot of everybody else. So you pretty much had like your top three and top four at that time with Boston, with Detroit later on, but the bottom of the Eastern Conference at that time wasn't that great. I believe they made like several playoffs under 500 before they became the Chicago that
Yep,
eventually
that's
formed.
very true. Very true. Thanks, Micah. Go ahead. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's pretty much said a good portion of what I feel. I also think, too, we can't underestimate that. Look, there was a lot more to those games than perhaps, now that we're older, we didn't see it as much, or we didn't understand it as much. I mean, certainly, if you look at Dr. J's team, I mean, Larry Bird is consistently giving credit to one guy on that team, and that was, Andrew Toney, uh, who was dubbed the Boston Strangler. They had Mo Cheeks, they had Bobby Jones. I mean, they had tremendous, tremendous talent. And I just think for when Mike got into the league, for Larry Bird, Mike wasn't the guy he had to get over to get to the championship. He was just a guy that he saw like, oh, he's going to be trouble. But he had the talent and he had the team that he could still beat Mike. So the investment with Mike to me wasn't as great as it was with Dr. J. When Dr. J, came in, I think Larry Bird kind of looked at that as like, okay, this is the guy I got to get through. And I don't think he ever had that with Mike. So I think when you don't have that built-in rivalry as much, you kind of
You
give
can
credit a
give
little bit faster.
kudos. You can give, you can
Right.
say those things because it's not like that person, you knew you were going to, at that time, they wouldn't acknowledge, it was acknowledged to like they were at the Dream Team when they had that conversation. And Mike said, it's my league. And they agreed. But that was 91. They were 92. They were, yeah. Yeah, now. But it wasn't his league in the 80s. He was just a great player in the 80s on a bad team. Were you done, Matt?
No, yeah. That's exactly where I was getting at. It's just, for Larry, it was like, it was a fun time because I mean, even though Michael was coming in, he was killing it, and he was dropping crazy points on him in the playoffs. Larry still knew they were going to win. So it little like to your point,
Yep.
it's just different.
Yep. I mean, the
Yeah,
80s were
but
basically fit. The 80s were basic. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was gonna say, but the aspect of the question is the individual prowess of Michael Jordan. Larry
Yep.
Bird was able to recognize that, and that's what I was stating earlier. Is
Yep.
that the team aspect? You almost have to kind of try your best to take that out, and that's what Larry
Yep.
Bird's saying. Because even then, Michael Jordan was unguardable. Now, I can
Hmm.
honestly say when I watched Julius Erving, and I told you before, he's my favorite basketball player all time, but he could be neutralized. And he didn't really take over games all the time, like a high. He did it, but he didn't do it like Jordan. Jordan would take over games. So if you're going to judge individuals, say who's better or this and that, Jordan was clearly better, and Larry Bird is being honest about that. Now, if you're going to ask a different question and say the intensity of a rivalry and play
Yeah,
within
that's a
playing,
different question. Yep.
that's a whole different question. And now it brings into Julius Erving versus Larry Bird and Julius Erving versus Magic's Lakers. And you're talking about
Yep.
some serious, real deal basketball. So that's why I say I understand where Larry Bird is coming from because trust me, Larry Bird could take over games too.
Yep.
So he could understand the prowess of a Michael Jordan because that guy there was literally one of the most amazing basketball players I ever seen. I hated him when he played, but since I've gotten older, I realize he's one of the best players I've ever seen play.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I wanted to know is that Pep's, like Dr. J off the court he was very, in terms of intelligence. I need to make sure I make because he wanted to make sure it was clear in the book. So I'm gonna make it clear here. Dr. J was, very intelligent. Like when he got into college, like he was graduated with a straight B average. And he got 1,000 on his SATs, and And if you remember the SATs, that's a high ass score, especially coming out of the inner city. He noted when he went to college, which is what I do during the day. I work with a nonprofit organization that, you know, really helps young people. Um, but when he went to college, he actually had to get a tutor to adapt to college level courses, even him as a B student. But he eventually got over that hump and he was doing really well. Even though he left school early, he went back to finish his degree. And from the beginning of his career, he invested for retirement, and his endorsements were very carefully planned, where he would get stock options when he could, and the deals were built to pay him, like, sometimes an annuity in a longer term. Like, there are things he set up that set the course for Jordan later, with Nike and other things. But I wanted to, and I'm going to write a piece on this today. I think it's important to note that Dr. J actually he was a co-owner of a NASCAR team, as a minority. They were one of the first, him and his partner, one of the first partially owned teams in NASCAR. He also owned a golf course at one point. Two of the things that Jordan is very proud of is that he owns a NASCAR team and he owns a golf course. So when we talk about how similar, he also at one point negotiated stock options in some of his deals that he had with Gatorade and others. They are long-term partnerships. So he learned eventually Dr. J's golf course would go out of business, and it did bankrupt him. He had to start over. And he eventually did start over and got his finances in order. That the golf course was a bad investment for him. They eventually sold the NASCAR team. But to me, Jordan, who everybody knows is my favorite player, he learned from the mistakes of Dr. J when he co-owned, now he co-owns a racing team, which is profitable. And he sank a lot of money into his golf course, but his golf course is now profitable. But he basically structured those deals to where he didn't make the same mistake that Dr. J did. And I think that that's what players are doing now as they watch Jordan with the deals and some of the things that he did. They learned from him and they're not making those same mistakes also off the court. So I think every generation learns and takes from the previous generation, and then you continue to build from there, skills on the court and off the court. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, Malika. I'm not sure the age group of the people who are listening to this, but at that time when Dr. J was playing, the early 80s, late 70s, the pro athlete receiving sponsorship deals was just beginning. It wasn't like at a high level. The guy that was really making the most money or who had the most prestige was O.J. Simpson with Hertz Rent a Car and some of the other companies that he was
Yeah, OJ was
representing.
tearing it up when it came to the
He was
endorsement and
killing it. He was
sponsorship.
killing it, Malika, like really, really killing it. And he was technically probably right up there with Dr. J. I kind of put OJ a little bit ahead of him in terms of being the most famous athlete, but it was beginning with Dr. J. And he was so well spoken. There was a lot of class and dignity. He just, when you heard him talk, you just looked at him as different than most of the pro athletes when you heard them talk. So I could see Madison Avenue being fascinated with Dr. J, and he was able to receive some deals, but it was just beginning. So when Magic and Larry came about, they kind of expanded on it, and then here you got um, Ernest Jordan himself really taking it over. So at that point,
It
more
took it to a
companies
whole
realized,
another level. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, they companies realized they weren't really related to sports in the past, and they realized that these athletes can sell their products, and that's what Jordan really benefited from that. But I'll be honest with you, Dr. J was one of the founding professional athletes in